In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use the attribute spreadsheet inside of Maya. Okay, now the attribute spreadsheet is one of these sort of hidden gems inside of Maya. It's a great little feature, especially whenever working with more complex scenes or when you need to work with several objects simultaneously. So we've seen throughout our different lessons where we can start to select certain objects and come in and start to change things like the render stats, changing different attributes, material attributes, whatever the case may be. The problem, though, is that for the most part, we can only do these objects one at a time. So you can come in and select multiple objects if you want, but you'll notice that it only shows you the attributes for the last object that you had selected. So if you needed to change the render stats for all of these objects at once, it's only going to change the render stats for the last object that you had selected. So normally, we would have to do these one by one by one. Now, this is where the attribute spreadsheet comes in. It basically allows us to make changes to lots of different attributes on lots of different objects simultaneously. So, for example, if I wanted to change the render stats for several objects, let's say maybe I wanted several different objects in my scene to have their primary visibility turned off. So, if I were to come in and select, let's say, several different objects in my scene, with these objects selected, now we can jump to the attribute spreadsheet. So go to Window, General Editors, and over to the attribute spreadsheet. That'll pop open this little window, and you can see it will load up the objects that we currently have selected. And this is where we can start to, again, change lots of different attributes. So we have visibility, translate, rotate, things like that. Now, one of the things that you may sometimes notice is that certain objects may not always have their attributes loaded up. So sometimes, whenever you select an object, in this case where we have something like the shape node, so if you select an object and go to the shape tab, this is where we start to find the render stats. Now, in certain versions of Maya, or in newer versions of Maya, it's much better about anytime you select an object, it will automatically load that into the attribute spreadsheet. However, sometimes what you may need to do is select an object and then press the down arrow key on your keyboard to make sure that the shape node is what is selected here in the attribute spreadsheet. Because again, the shape node is where a lot of these different attributes are going to be found. So if I come in and grab multiple objects here, you can see now we have several different objects selected, and now we can start to come in and for all of these objects we could turn off things like primary visibility. So right now you can see it's on for all of these objects. If I click on this column, I can now just simply type in off and turn that off, and you can see now that has now been disabled. You can also just use the flags 0 and 1. So 0 means off, 1 means on. So again, if I turn the primary visibility off on all of these, render that out, and with one click, I was able to disable the primary visibility on all of these objects. Now this also becomes really useful for lights. Like I said, there's almost nothing that we can't do with this attribute spreadsheet. So this can be used for manipulating geometry, for manipulating lights, manipulating materials, whatever the case may be. So let's say that we go over into the Hypershade. Now what I'd like to do is use this attribute spreadsheet for controlling a couple of my different lights. So what I'd like to do is take my point light and my directional light and start to soften up some of the shadows that we are getting with these lights, because you can see at the moment they're pretty harsh and sharp shadows. So what I should be able to do is grab both of these at the same time, just shift select, and now with these selected, go over to the attribute spreadsheet. You can see we do have the shape node loaded up over here, and again, the shape node is where the attributes are contained that I need to adjust. Again, if you select an object and you don't see its shape node loaded up, just need to press the down arrow key on your keyboard and load that up. Okay, so I'm going to jump across and go over to this All tab. This is where you can find pretty much everything that has to do with the light or whatever object it is that you have loaded up. So let's come in and look for some of these attributes. Sometimes these can be a little bit tricky to find just because there are sometimes so many attributes to go through. But what we're looking at or looking for is this light angle. So that'll be the first thing that we adjust. So let's continue to look over here. All right, maybe it's actually back over this way. There we are. There's the light angle. So let's try setting this maybe to something like 0.5. There we are, and you can see that now changes that. We also have the number of shadow rays. So if we were to come in here and look for the shadow rays, so that's going to be, I believe, over here on this far side, kind of over toward the left, if memory serves. Again, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to find. There we are. There's the number of shadow rays. Let's try bumping this up to maybe something like 7. Again, I like to start with relatively low values and then gradually work my way up until I find values that give me kind of that right mix of quality and speed. Okay, now if you take a look at the render as it exists now, there's really not just a whole lot of difference. You can start to see a little bit of a change where now, compared to what we had before, you can see this sort of a directional lights shadow has started to soften up a bit. But if you take a look at the point light and the shadow that it's casting, you notice it really doesn't look any softer. So let's take a look at that. So right now we do have this directional lights light angle set up to 0.5. Now if we take a look at the point light, you can see its light radius is still set to 0. Now this is where we sort of need to be careful whenever working with objects that are not exactly the same. So the point light and the directional light, while they are both Maya lights, sometimes the attributes can be a little bit different. So for the directional light, this size is called the light angle, where over here it's called the light radius. And you can see whenever we had both of these loaded up, and whenever we were changing something like the light angle, it was only changing that attribute on the directional light. So again, while this attribute spreadsheet is really, really useful, we just need to be careful when it comes to loading up objects that are a little bit different. So let's maybe just go back to the point light and bump its light radius up a little bit. Okay, now looking at that, really not just a huge change, at least as far as these point light shadows are concerned. So sometimes we may need to crank this light radius up quite a bit. Again, that's entirely dependent on your particular scene and your scene scale. So in my case, I'll try to bump this up a little bit more radically. We'll try to take this up to something like 10. Okay, that's getting to be a little bit better now. So if you compare what we have now to what we had before, definitely now starting to get some softening of these shadows, especially as we start to get a little bit further away from that shadow casting source. So up closer to the wings, the shadows still stay fairly sharp, which is what we would expect. But as that shadow starts to get further away from the shadow casting source, now it's really starting to spread out. So that's starting to get quite a bit more realistic now. So we might see what happens if we were to maybe bump that radius up to 20, maybe try to soften up that shadow just a little bit more. There we go. I like that a little bit more. So now we have kind of these nice soft shadows. And in my case, bumping up this light radius really makes almost no impact on my render time. What we really see will start to slow down the render time is the increasing of these shadow rays. But in my case, I've tried to keep these fairly low, and it's actually doing a pretty good job, so I don't really see any need to crank this up any higher than what I already have it. Okay, so in our next lesson, we'll continue to build upon and start to add some of the finishing touches to this animation.